Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this lecture is titled America Becomes a World Empire. The main idea we are hoping to convey is contained in the thesis statement on your screen. Economic, religious, moral, and nationalistic motivations combined to fuel American expansionism in the late 1890s. So America's imperial ambitions had several parts, several pieces, sort of like an equation in algebra. Some people would say America became a world power because it wanted to control the world or because it wanted to take over or something. But there are at least four main parts. A plus B plus C plus D. Not all of them exactly equal, but certainly enough to qualify as four distinct motivations: economic, religious, moral, and nationalistic. America becomes an exemplary society. America becomes an exemplary society, point one. As early as the Puritan migration from England to Massachusetts in the 17th century, Americans faced the dilemma of how to do good in a world that does wrong. John Winthrop, the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, tried to set up what he called a city on a hill in the New World, a model of righteous living for others in the world, especially Protestant Christians in Europe, to behold and imitate. Winthrop said, "We shall be as a city on a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." And that desire, that wish, which was in some ways reaffirmed in slightly different terms during the American Revolution, became a permanent goal of American policy toward the outside world. This is an illustration of that appeared in a newspaper in Massachusetts in 1788, titled "On the Erection of the 11th Pillar." The Massachusetts Sentinel, a Boston newspaper, had begun a series of illustrations showing the federal pillars rising to support a grand Republican superstructure, which was a metaphor for the US Constitution. As each state ratified the proposed Constitution, an additional pillar was raised. On August 2nd, 1788, the Sentinel published a cartoon showing the pillar representing New York had been erected. And inside this pillar would live not the gods of ancient Rome or Greece, but in the pillar that was created would live liberty or freedom. So there, and you can see the poem here, the federal edifice or structure. 11 stars in quick succession rise, 11 columns strike our wondering eyes. Soon o'er the whole shall swell the beauteous dome, Columbia's boast and freedom's hallowed home. Here shall the arts in glorious splendor shine, and agriculture give her stores divine. Commerce refined dispense us more than gold, and this new world teach wisdom to the old. Religion here shall fix her blessed abode, arrayed in mildness like its parent God. Justice and law shall endless peace maintain, and the Saturnian age return again. So there's a lot of optimism that this new world will teach wisdom to the old world. Those are some early expressions of the national mission to be an exemplary society. In the 19th century, it continued to express itself. James Monroe, the 5th president of the United States, issued a document called the Monroe Doctrine in 1823. That doctrine, largely authored by John Quincy Adams, pointed out important moral differences between the monarchical, arbitrary governments of Europe and the free republican institutions of the New World. So again, the United States is showing a sharp difference between its institutions and those of Europe. As Spanish colonies in South and Central America followed the American revolutionary model, President Monroe warned Europe to stay out of affairs in this hemisphere. In succeeding decades, one historian has written, a number of distinguished European visitors came to study democracy in America. And here they found widespread democracy, representatives and responsive political and legal institutions, a religious commitment to the idea of human perfectibility, unlimited energy, and the ability to apply unregulated economic activity and inventive genius to produce more things for more people. The problem, of course, is how to do good in an evil world. In a world that had much wrong, the United States believed that it stood as a transforming force for good, as one has written. Many people agreed. The problem, of course, is that the United States was deeply committed to staying out of European affairs. We call this isolationism. And it is difficult for an isolationist country that in theory wants to keep to itself to transform the world. If you stay at home, you can't help others outside your home, so to speak. So if the United States is going to be a transformative force in the world, it would need a more aggressive foreign policy. Point 2, America becomes an expansionist nation. Americans really are not a patient people in the sense that they set a good example and wait for others to follow. That would require a lot of patience, probably not an American trait in great measure. The United States has always been actively involved in exporting its ideas, its values, sometimes imposing its values and institutions on other countries. Now, before 1850, the United States was in its early phase of expansion. And the early expansion of the United States was what we call continental expansion. That is, going from the Atlantic Ocean on the right side of your map to the Pacific Ocean on the left side of your map. So there's a lot of expansion that took place before 1850 and when California became a state. So most of the expansion of the United States, not all, but most of it, was limited to filling up the continent between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, as you can see on this map, which had multiple phases. And you don't need to know all those phases. We usually talk about those in History 11, the class prior to this one. But nonetheless, there's a map, you can sort of see the territorial expansion. But after 1850, the United States outlook on expansion started to change. By 1850, William Seward, the Secretary of State of the United States, encouraged many Americans to look outward beyond the border of the United States. Notice on this map the emphasis on ships, transatlantic trade in the yellow circle to the lower left there, trade between the United States and Europe. And then notice the small map at the bottom in red for a proposed railroad across Panama to facilitate trade between the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. So the United States is looking outward after 1850. The Commodore Perry visited Japan. There's a great or expanded trade with China. And there are a number of expeditions into the Caribbean states looking for more land to grow cotton. And of course, the emphasis on a canal across Panama, as we indicated. William Seward was the Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln, and he pushed this outward expansionist goal. Seward believed that the United States was destined to exercise commercial domination on the Pacific Ocean, its islands and continents. And he had a very strong vision of American expansion. This is a close-up of the proposed line of the Panama Railroad from the Pacific Ocean to the Caribbean, as you can see there. Americans in 1850 were already looking for a way to transport goods across Panama, creating a trade route that would link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Seward's folly. On March 30th, 1867, Secretary of State William Seward agreed to purchase Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, a transaction that came to be known as Seward's folly, or his mistake. The press in the United States mocked his willingness to spend so much on what it called Seward's icebox or refrigerator, and Andrew Johnson's polar bear garden. Here you can see a picture of William Seward on the left. This is a map of the Alaska Territory, otherwise known as Seward's Folly. You can see the trade routes that are possible from Alaska, which of course now is the largest state of the 50 United States in terms of territory and its connection to different parts of the world. William Seward not only purchased Alaska, but he also acquired a number of coaling stations in the Pacific, particularly on in the Midway Islands, where there were already merchants and missionaries. And so Seward, and his successors acquiring these various islands in the Pacific, was sort of trying to chart a path for American commercial expansion in Japan, Korea, and China. William Seward also, as Secretary of State, advocated the annexation of Cuba and other islands in the West Indies. And of course, his larger dreams, for the most part, were not realized, but he laid the foundation and the framework for other expansionist leaders to continue after he was out of power. This is a coaling station in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, 1919. Most steamships in the late 19th century were powered by coal. So ships on very long trips needed to refuel at coaling stations. This is an actual photograph from 1919 of the coaling station at Pearl Harbor. If you look really closely on the photograph, you can see these large stacks of coal. And then the ships would come and be refueled or filled up with coal, so they could continue from Hawaii to Southeast Asia for trade. This is a list of territories acquired by the United States after 1857. That's quite an extensive list. We won't go through it, but it starts at the top and then continues all the way down to the bottom. And this is a significant number of acquisitions in terms of territory on the part of the United States. You can see the details of the transactions on the right. Seward's expansionist ideas live on. The United States was always reluctant to add territory outright. But American interests in Latin America and Asia were eager to dominate commercially. In other words, Americans wanted to dominate trade. They did not necessarily want to dominate large tracts of land. They wanted trade. A number of American leaders spoke in terms of commercial domination, at least between the United States and Europe, and the United States and Asia. This is President Benjamin Harrison, who became president in 1889, served one term. The United States was pursuing commercial dominance in our hemisphere. That means from the United States through Central and South America, North America, Central and South America, and the Caribbean. The United States wanted to sort of have commercial domination and commercial control in that section, in that hemisphere. But an incident in 1891 illustrates the need to be more involved militarily and diplomatically in the hemisphere. In 1891, American relations with Chile were harmed when a number of American sailors on shore leave were involved in a barroom fight in Valparaiso, Chile. 2 Americans were killed, a number of others were injured. As one historian wrote, American pride was injured also, and President Benjamin Harrison sent an ultimatum to Chile demanding prompt and full reparation. After threatening war, the United States forced Chile to comply. So the United States is asserting itself in Chile, which is a long ways removed from the American mainland. And then another incident in Hawaii shows us American assertion, or how the United States tried to create for itself commercial dominance in the Pacific. U.S. expansionists were following the dreams of William Seward in the Pacific. By the middle of the 1870s, U.S. sugar growing interests in the Hawaiian Islands were strong enough to put whites in positions of influence over the native monarchy. In 1875, now you don't need to memorize all the details, but in 1875, the American commercial or sugar interests were able to obtain a treaty that admitted Hawaiian sugar duty-free into the United States. So it would be substantially lower in price. And when the treaty was renewed, I believe in 1887, the United States also gained exclusive rights to build a naval base on the island of Oahu at Pearl Harbor. What upset Native Hawaiians and what they resented was not only the growing influence of U.S. sugar interest over their country, but the United States started to give sugar field jobs in the sugar fields to Japanese immigrants who would come into Hawaii and would work at substantially lower rates in the sugarcane fields. Between 1885 and 1924, over 200,000 Japanese workers migrated to Hawaii, and about another 200,000 migrated to the west coast of the United States. In 1891, this woman, Queen Liliuokalani, the strongly nationalistic Queen of Hawaii, in 1891, she ascended to the throne, and she abolished the Constitution, and she tried to establish control over whites in the name of what she said was Hawaii for the Hawaiians. But 2 years later, with the help of US Marines and gunboats, sugar planters who were afraid of losing influence and of the Queen's possible turning to Japan for political support, staged a palace coup, or a revolution that someone later called a revolution of sugar, by sugar, and for sugar. Here you can see US Navy Blue Jackets taking position in front of the Arlington Hotel during the overthrow of Hawaiian Queen Liliuokalani in January 1893. The new president of the United States, Grover Cleveland, came back to the White House for a second term, and he prevented the Senate from ratifying a treaty with Hawaii. But even Grover Cleveland, even the president of the United States, could not remove white sugar growers from power in Hawaii. So they waited until a more favorable time, which occurred during the war in 1898. World power without proper means and policy. The growing number of conflicts in the Caribbean and in the Pacific showed or demonstrated the fact that the United States had a powerful presence far beyond our borders. It had power in Chile, it had power in the Caribbean, had power in Hawaii. But the United States did not have the means or the policies to properly enlarge its role in the world. That is, it didn't have a plan. It sort of just grew big. You know, you hear stories of someone, you know, when we're growing up and we go to grade school, and then you say goodbye to each other in June, and then in September, when you come back to school, someone in your grade grew really big and grew so big he doesn't fit into his clothing anymore. That's sort of the way the United States was. It grew really fast and its clothes didn't fit. That is, it didn't have the proper means. It was big and it was now becoming at least a hemispheric power, but it didn't have the means or the policies or the plans to be a hemispheric power. For example, the diplomatic service of the US State Department around the world was backward, inefficient. Record keeping was sloppy. We know that illegal passports were issued, that we know the diplomatic officials got involved in local disputes. They were insensitive toward indigenous cultures and peoples. For example, as one historian has noted, not until the 1930s did a US embassy official in Beijing speak Chinese. The US Army, numbering about 28,000 people, 28,000 members of a fighting force in the mid-1980s, the US Army ranked 13th in the world behind the Army of Bulgaria. The Navy had been largely downsized after the Civil War, only partly rebuilt. Our Navy ranked no better than 10th in the world. And we had a lot of ships with outdated boilers and things like that. So, as one has written, limited, backward instruments of foreign policy could not support the aspirations of an emerging world power like the United States, especially one whose rise to power had come so quickly. Looking for new frontiers in the 1890s. America runs out of room. In 1893, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner wrote that for 3 centuries, the dominant fact in American life has been expansion. Turner observed, quote, that the extension of American influence to outlying islands and adjoining countries indicated that expansion would continue. So America runs out of room, but it dreams of expansion outside its borders. And those words seem to accurately describe the motivations and aspirations of many Americans of all kinds. If the Western frontier is closed, then Americans will look for new frontiers. They wanted markets, they wanted mission fields, they wanted influence and political power. So the motivation for the expansionist decades after the 1890s were similar in many respects to the motivations that had resembled people, to the motivations that had sort of influenced people to come in the first place. That is, the expansionist ideas of the 1890s were similar to the original expansionist ideas that people brought with them. People came to the New World, the Spaniards, the Portuguese, the French, the Dutch. They were looking for money, they were looking for glory, and they were doing it, they said, for the glory of God. So the motivations of the 1890s were not, in many respects, all that different. So we will look at some of those motivations. The motivations for the expansionist impulse of the late 1890s resembled those that had prompted people to settle the New World in the first place: greed, or money, glory, and, as they said, God. Profits and dreams of overseas markets. This man, U.S. Senator Albert Beveridge from the state of Indiana, represents the thinking of many American leaders in the 1890s. This man in 1898 said this: American factories are making more than the American people can use. America's soil is producing more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours. Men like Beveridge and others, they believed in the dreams that William Seward had talked about and had laid out. And these people like Beveridge and others just continued to pursue those dreams of Seward's expansionism from the 1850s and 60s. The United States believed that it was important to get commercial dominance and a share of the European market. This was a time of social Darwinism, or at least the beginnings of it in the 1890s. And the idea is that just as the strongest animals survive, so too the strongest countries survive. So countries must be strong, they must be dominant. And in fact, it's almost nature to be dominant. And weak countries will fade away, only strong countries will survive. So the United States believed that it must have a strong, dominant share of world markets to stay competitive with Europeans, and then they were attracted by the availability of products and raw materials like sugar, coffee, fruits, oil, rubber, and precious minerals. Business interest shape diplomatic and military strategy. By 1900, the United States was a recognized world power with substantial commercial, political, and military interests and territorial holdings throughout the Pacific region. Maritime or naval or sea expansion led to the proclamation of an open door policy for China in 1899 to 1900 and set the stage for much greater involvement in local and regional politics and trade during the early 20th century. Great Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan maintained significant physical and commercial presences in China, and they were protective of their various spheres of influence and trading privileges there, as well as elsewhere in Asia. The United States proposed a free, open market and equal trading opportunity for merchants of all nationalities operating in China. The virtues of expansion. We have talked in a previous lecture about the tremendous growth of U.S. industrial production and agricultural production. And as Senator Beveridge said a moment ago in that slide, we read his words in that previous slide, the United States was, in a sense, I don't want to say drowning, but the United States had a tremendous amount of excessive production, what we call overproduction. But there was not enough demand inside the United States to purchase all of the production. So we call that underconsumption of overproduction. And many business leaders preferred to open up new markets instead of laying off workers, which would cause riots, economic depression, and social upheaval. So business leaders have multiple motivations to expand. And if the United States produces so much here, it could export what it produced and sell it to other countries. In 1896, the newly formed National Association of Manufacturers stated that the trade centers of Central and South America are natural markets for American products. Expansion, especially to new overseas markets, and we want to emphasize this idea, was an attractive alternative to drowning in overproduction. patriotism, and expanded commerce. Another motivation, apart from commercial dominance and apart from markets, has to do with honor, national pride. The United States was determined not to be left out of the international competition that was then in effect between the powers of Europe and Japan. The England, France, and Germany were very often on the verge of war as they scrambled for colonies, and they saw colonial expansion and territorial expansion as an indication of economic power and national glory. So in 1898, a State Department memorandum said the United States can no longer afford to disregard international rivalries now that we ourselves have become a competitor in the worldwide struggle for trade. So therefore, the United States government sees itself as a partner with business interests to expand trade. So diplomatic policy and business strategy will work together to expand US markets around the world. This cartoon highlights the imperial ambitions of the United States after the Spanish-American War of 1898. Uncle Sam, to the right, representing the United States, says to President William McKinley, quote, "Finish the canal, McKinley, and make our national expansion complete in your first administration." McKinley, who was assassinated in 1901, did not live to build a canal connecting the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico. But his successor, President Theodore Roosevelt, successfully led efforts to construct the Panama Canal. We call this the large policy. So the United States moves from continentalism, a concern with economic activity on the American mainland, to the large policy, which has to do with policy around the world, particularly as it concerns trade. And you can see in this cartoon on the left, all these ships coming down the Pacific, trying to get through to the Atlantic, and then all the ships coming from the Atlantic, trying to get through to the Pacific. Sea power and national greatness. The writings of this man, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was a naval strategist and who had written a number of books on the importance of sea power to national greatness. This man had a strong influence over American business and political leaders. Mahan argued, in the words of one, that in a world of Darwinian struggle for survival, national power depended on naval supremacy, control of sea lanes, and vigorous development of domestic resources and foreign markets. He strongly supported American colonies, both in the Caribbean and the Pacific, linked by a canal that would be controlled by the United States. This is his book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Strong nations, Mahan wrote, have a special responsibility to dominate weak ones. And this, of course, is the thinking of social Darwinism. In a world of constant strife, Mahan wrote, where everywhere nation is arrayed against nation, it is imperative that Americans look outward. Expansion and the white man's burden, so-called. Expansion and the white man's burden. The United States had a strong sense of duty and almost a missionary ideal of doing good for others. It wanted to lift up other people. A statesman once wrote, "With God's help, we will lift Shanghai or China up and up, ever up, until it is just like Kansas City." That's a comment from U.S. Senator Kenneth Wherry from the state of Nebraska. Here you can see Kansas City, Missouri, a very dominant city in that time, and one, I might add, that's beginning to make its way back now as we speak. This map shows a spotlight from Kansas City, Missouri, down to Port Arthur, Texas. And you can see railroads and ships you can see the American products go down the railroad, down to Port Arthur, where they're put on ships, and then they steam their way to Cuba, to Europe. And of course, they could go to the right if there's a Panama Canal and go the other way. So the United States is very interested in developing products, having a strong infrastructure to send American goods out of the country around the world. But there's a thin line between helping people and meddling or interfering in their affairs. When the United States saw itself as a model nation, a nation that others could imitate, sometimes that idea could be used as a justification to exploit or oppress weaker nations. This man, an English poet, Rudyard Kipling, wrote these words: "It is a national duty or burden, the white man's burden, that civilized nations undertake to bring peace, progressive values, and ordered liberty to the world." So it's almost like a religious or moral obligation to lift up other peoples. That people like Kipling expressed, the so-called white man's burden. Some people took this to inappropriate extremes. One man, a missionary, a preacher named Josiah Strong, encouraged missionary expansion. In his book, Our Country, published in 1885, he wrote a chapter called The Future of the Anglo-Saxon Race, or the White Race. He said, "This powerful race," referring to Anglo-Saxons, "this powerful race will move down upon Mexico, down upon Central and South America, out upon the islands of the sea, over upon Africa and beyond." And of course, time has proven that that is a false prediction. American missionaries carry American values. This is not intended to denigrate or to criticize people who share their faith, but many American missionaries traveled to non-American countries with business teams, if you will. That is to say, as American business interests moved out, American missionaries moved out as well. And perhaps sometimes some of those missionaries, some of them, not all of them, some of them didn't make a clear distinction that they were not there for the same reasons that the business interests were there. China was a very favorite destination. The number of American Protestant missionaries, one expert tells us, the number of American Protestant missionaries in China increased from 436 missionaries in 1874 to 5,462 in 1914. So within 40 years, the number increased by more than 12 times. And the largest increase came in the 1890s. Although the number of Chinese converts to Christianity was not as large as some missionaries had once thought would be possible. This is a painting of the European factories at Canton, China, sometimes called the 13 Factories District. Before 1850, most trading partners of China conducted business in this very section called the 13 Factories District. So European nations would come, trade here, and then leave, but they didn't go inland. These are two American missionaries to China in a photograph. Hudson Taylor and his wife Maria, founders of what came to be called the China Inland Mission. This is a disturbing photograph of Chinese women, a Chinese woman with unbound feet on the left, and on the right, a picture of a Chinese woman with lily feet or bound feet in Canton, from that very region where the trading district was in 1902. Foot binding of women in China was very common. You can see on the right a shoe, and then on the left, the foot that's made to look like that, because many people believed, many Chinese men and women believed that was a thing of beauty, to have feet like that. But of course, it's not the way the body was intended or the feet were intended to be. This is an X-ray of bound feet from China in the Library of Congress, 1923. You can see how the feet are forced to grow like that. On the left, X-ray views of a normal foot, and on the right, X-ray views of a bound foot. A bound foot measured about 4 inches in length. And this is a shoe, a Chinese shoe for women with bound feet. Men's feet were not bound. This is a photograph of Dr. Susie Carson Reinhardt, missionary to China and a strong opponent of foot binding. So she was a missionary who not only shared her faith, but she shared her medical expertise to encourage women not to have their feet bound, which of course was a very controversial position for someone to take. And much could be said about Dr. Reinhardt, but she was an incredibly important missionary. So I want to encourage all of us to know that missionaries were not there. Missionaries were not there purely to gain converts. They were also there to help. And Dr. Reinhardt is exemplary in this respect because she shows a religious faith that's sort of connected to medical wisdom. That's a very different motivation than some might think Americans took with them or Europeans took with them in this case. To summarize, America became a world empire rather quickly after the Civil War ended, in the post-Civil War years, and the 1890s, and then the early 20th century. But we must keep in mind that American expansion, American imperialism, was motivated by different factors, sometimes economic, sometimes religious, moral, or even nationalistic. They combine together. And sometimes a rope with multiple strands is stronger because it becomes a cord. And American expansion was in many ways strong because it had four different strands in it, at least four major strands. So the idea is simply that expansionism and American imperialism had multiple reasons. There were multiple reasons that Americans wanted to do this. I hope that this lecture has been interesting, informative. If you have any questions, I encourage you to contact me, and we'll do our best to clarify any questions or comments that you might have. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.